Has it doubled up on me? There it is. Okay, perfect. Right. So, we ended here last time with the essentially dismantling of the Articles of Confederation and the creation of the Constitution, which wasn't this I gotta find my words, it's been a long week. It wasn't just like a top-down thing. They sent it to all the various states and had them choose whether they would ratify it or not. And this caused a split, a political split with the Federalists and Anti-Federalists. Federalists wanted to ratify it, whereas the Anti-Federalists obviously did not. And the main thing about the Anti-Federalists is that they mostly were identified by what they stood against as opposed to what they stood for. But they did push for a Bill of Rights to be added to the Constitution, which was important because, hey, cool, we needed that. And in fact, it wasn't until a Bill of Rights was promised that New York and Virginia finally agreed to ratify the Constitution. So that's the whole thing. I think we have the map here. Federalists, Anti-Federalists, and this whole and I like using these because this is from that era. Like this is before the final two states, which again the book says New York and Virginia. This shows North Carolina and Rhode Island. So I don't know. Don't worry about it. Yeah. So with the Constitution now put in place, political leaders were hoping that the factionalization, the partisanship of Federalists and Anti-Federalists would go away because, well, again, their big fight was over the Constitution. And, well, the Constitution has been ratified. So technically the Federalists won, but also the Anti-Federalists kind of got what they wanted because their concern was over the Bill of Rights, and there was a Bill of Rights added to the Constitution. So everybody got a little bit of what they wanted, so that's good. Washington was elected the first president, with zero pushback. So everybody's like, yeah, this works. John Adams was made vice president April 30th, 1789 in New York City, which was the capital at the time. This goes back and forth between New York and Philadelphia until we'll get to that. He also established the various departments of state, the various departments, including the Department of State, War, Treasury, and Justice. They made Thomas Jefferson the Secretary of State because, again, he was our documents guy, so he's the one to put in charge of Secretary of State. That makes sense. Henry Knox was made Secretary of War. He was the general that helped to move, I forgot the name of the fort yesterday, but I remember it now. He moved the cannons down from Fort Ticonderoga to Washington when Washington was trying to take back Boston from the British. So I imagine he did other stuff as well. The book just doesn't mention his other feats during the war. But either way, he was put in charge of our military. Alexander Hamilton was made Secretary of Treasury. Again, really good pick. Um, he's, as we're going to see going forward, he's like the guy to give the money to figure out how best to use it. And then we have Edmund Randolph as Attorney General, head of the Department of Justice, who we will never see again. Edmund Randolph, he's not in the book ever again. I'm going to have a picture of him just like with the rest of these guys, and that's it. He's not at all important when it comes to the test, but hey, he was there. Congress was very busy starting out because, I mean, well, we're building or rebuilding, really, the government. They put together the Supreme Court with the Judiciary Act of 1789. They had to put together the Bill of Rights. So the Bill of Rights was originally 200 proposals, or more than 200 proposals, yeah, that James Madison went around and collected from various states that they've eventually narrowed down to 12, and then in 1791, 10 of them were made into the Bill of Rights, which gave certain rights to individuals and states, which became essentially the first 10 amendments. Which also set the precedent that the Constitution can be amended and changed, and things that aren't specifically in the Constitution can be added later because times change from when the Constitution was made. Even though the Constitution was made like just like a year or two before, they went ahead and set the precedent that like this is an evolving document that can change over time. So here's Washington and the boys. So you got Knox, Hamilton, Jefferson, and again Randolph is the last time we're going to say. And then the Supreme Court, which the only one here that's really important is John Jay. If you guys recall him, he was part of the Federalists working with Madison and, not Madison. He was working with Hamilton, and I guess it was Madison. Anyway, yeah, Madison and Hamilton. Anyway, and he comes up later as well because he's also apparently a diplomat. I don't know when he got the time to do all this stuff, considering he was also apparently sick, unless there's another John Jay, and I'm just not realizing it. But, yeah. So here's Madison giving a speech while presenting the Bill of Rights. Civil rights of none shall be abridged on account of religious belief or worship, nor shall any national religion be established, nor shall the full and equal rights of conscience be in any manner or any pretext infringed. Which is to say, unlike Britain, we aren't going to have a national religion, because if we did, that would imply, by its very existence, that the government would have some level of coercion to force people to follow that national religion. And, oh, it meowed. And, that's not what the Founding Fathers had in mind. So, unfortunately, this is still something that needs to be, that certain people in power need to be reminded of. Right, back to Hamilton. So he knew early on that the nation needed a stable credit when it came to like global economics in order to grow. So one of the first things he wanted to do was to pay the national debt and then roll the various state debts into that. Because if you paid off the national debt, but but various states still had their own debts, it would still make the government weak. Because, well, I mean, you can see today, like, certain states are doing really well, and certain states are, like, economically in the hole, and it hurts the country as a whole. So, yeah. Um, so, some of the plans for paying off this debt, government bonds, which I believe I've mentioned before, essentially, you pay the government, you give money to the government, and they give you this bond, um, which you can then redeem years down the road and make a little bit of money back, a little bit more money back. Um, it's mostly something that you do during war when the government's like really hard up for cash, and you're like, oh, we're gonna do our patriotic duty and give money to the government, and then later on, you can get that money back along with a little extra because hopefully the government will be doing better by that point. Um, Excise tax on goods traded within the states, which is to say, it's just trade tax. Then also tariffs on imported goods, specifically like stuff that we're already producing, not just everything, because that's not how tariffs work. But what do I know? I'm just a historian that has seen this before. Also, though, he wanted to establish a central bank for the U.S., which I'll get into a bit more in a minute. That was kind of a big deal. It also caused some issues among other individuals in the government, but we'll get to that also in just a minute. Okay, that was a good. I'm assuming that was a good sound. Thankfully, my school was really poor, and we just were given eggs. I mean, my class was like 6 people. That's how little we were. However, paying back these debts at face value caused some issues. People that bought bonds during the war, and then needed money right away, otherwise they'd starve, often sold them to speculators for a fraction of what they were worth. So if you bought like $50 worth of bonds, but you needed money right now to survive and sold them for, say, $5 to these speculators. And then Hamilton was like, oh, well, we'll just buy them all back for full price. Well, too bad you've already sold them to these speculators who were like, well, maybe they'll be worth full value in the future. You've lost out on that, which on the one hand, that's what speculators do. They're like, well, maybe this will be worth something in the future, and also these people are desperate, so they're willing to sell it for really cheap. Is that illegal? No. It's shitty, but that's what speculators are. You never hear about the good guy speculators. There are always people trying to take advantage of people that are desperate. Also, when it came to paying off state debts, Virginia was not having it because they'd already paid off their debts. And you know how some people can be where they're like, oh, well, I already paid my share, so why should anybody else get help? So Virginia was appeased by a plan to move the capital, which was now, at that time, in Philadelphia, to a more central location, which is to say where D.C. is now. Put it on the Potomac River, which was technically not in Virginia, but like along the border of Virginia. And that made Virginia feel special, so that was good enough for them. Obviously, Jefferson and Madison, being Jefferson and Madison, were opposed to this for various reasons. Let me see. Yeah. And the central bank was like the big thing. Because having a federal bank implied a lot of power, essentially. It implied a degree of power for the government. And while it would definitely be good for the economy, while like where they were at, it was technically not covered in the Constitution. And this is where the two factions diverge again. So the group that were the Federalists had a more loose interpretation of Congress, I always say that, Constitution, which is to say, if the Constitution doesn't say we can't do this thing, then it should be fine. Whereas the other group, the anti-federalists, or as we're going to see, they eventually call themselves the Democratic Republicans, if the Constitution doesn't say we can do this, then we can't. Which is really restrictive. So there was a bit of pushback on this national bank thing, but it was seen as too much of a positive move for the U.S. to ignore, so it was voted in favor of. But also kind of keep this in mind, because when we get to Jefferson at the end of this chapter, and, well, not the end of this chapter, but the next chapter, and some of the stuff he gets up to, it's at the very least ironic. To me, it's kind of funny, because, again, if it's not in the Constitution, you can't do it. But then he ends up doing a lot of stuff that's not in the Constitution, because it's really, really important for the growth of the U.S., and he sees that, and he's like, I mean, we gotta do it, and nobody's disagreeing with him. He's the only one that's agonizing over it, but we'll get to that. So here is the first national bank. I mean, you've seen banks like this. Usually not actually made of, stone and marble. It's just fake plaster anymore. But yeah, our founding fathers really liked Greco-Roman style, Corinthian columns and all that. I mean, that's kind of what our governing system was based on too, was the old Roman Republic and Athenian democracy sort of thing. I took a whole graduate course about that. Also, here is where they were going to put Washington City, which eventually becomes D.C., but we'll get to that later as well. Has anyone in here ever been to D.C.? You have? What time of year did you go? Do you remember? During the summer? Good, perfect. How was the weather? Extremely hot. So, yeah, because it's in basically Virginia, which isn't that far north from here. And you've got the Potomac River, and then also the Eastern Branch, which is essentially just more part of the river. And they're slow-moving rivers. They're not fast-flowing like the Mississippi. And especially in parts like this, you've got eddies where the water will slow down and really to some points just stagnate entirely. What happens in stagnant water, especially in places where it's hot and humid most of the year? You get that, but what else that will spread beyond the water? Mosquitoes, that's what I'm looking for. And back then, mosquitoes meant malaria and all sorts of other stuff. I mean, yellow fever and whatever else. So they were building their new capital in a swamp, just like they did with Jamestown. Which is why the phrase "drain the swamp" in politics is they're talking about DC, because DC is literally a swamp. But we'll get to the building of Washington City a little bit more later. But yeah, it's not the greatest spot. I think I must have gone in the early spring because it wasn't that hot when I went. I think it was like just before the cherry blossoms bloom, because the tourists weren't that bad. But I mostly was there for like the Smithsonian. So, as I mentioned, the two big driving factors in how our government was going to be run was Jefferson and Madison, and they were polar opposites. Jefferson wanted an agricultural base for he wanted an agricultural nation. He wanted us to just be a nation of farmers, which was a nice utopian ideal, but it didn't really gel well with the rest of the world starting to become industrial. Also, while this was going on, we had the French Revolution. We had France on fire and fighting the rest of Europe. And I mean the rest of Europe. They pretty much took over Spain. But they fought Austria and Prussia, which is to say Germany, and Italy, and Russia, and Britain. They fought the rest of Europe for, the 10 years there is the Revolution, and then after that is Napoleon. So they fought the rest of Europe for decades. And when you're fighting across vast swaths of territory, you're not going to get much farming done. So European food supplies were greatly impacted. So they were buying a lot of food from America, and therefore American exports when it came to food went way up because, hey, they needed food, we were growing it. Cool, it worked out for us. But there were a lot of other implications when it came to the French Revolution. And it still, to this day, surprises me that so little happened when it came to the French Revolution, at least over here. Obviously a lot happened over in Europe. But France was trying to overturn a monarchy and establish a republic, which is what we did. And so there were a number of our political leaders who supported the French Revolution, that supported, like Jefferson and Madison supported this move to overthrow the king and establish a republic in France. However, the French Revolution quickly became violent, in part because they weren't separated from their monarchy by an ocean. They were right there. And most of the revolution occurred in Paris. Our revolution didn't happen in London. So a lot of this resulted in priests, aristocrats, and royals being executed, often just in the streets, not even with a guillotine. They were just like yanked out of homes and torn apart in the streets. So the Federalists, who were the closest to like the elites we had here in the U.S., were not sure if we should support this sort of revolution, even though, again, we just had ours, but now they're like, oh, well, this is going too far. It's like, we literally just had a violent revolution against the British. What's wrong with you guys? Now, also, I should mention that we did have a treaty with France that if they were attacked by an outside force, we would help them. So it was mainly, the next time Britain attacks you, because it's going to happen, we'll help out. We weren't so much seeing a revolution happening in the future. And again, technically the treaty was with the French crown, but we definitely weren't going to help the French crown, like, stamp out a rebellion. So the whole thing was like, should we help the rebellion? Should we just, like, not step in? What should we do? Eventually, we had the Neutrality Act in 93, where we just stayed out of it. Belligerent ships, which is, say, the French and the British, couldn't use American ports, but it did mean that American ships could go to both the French and British to trade and supply them with goods. Edmond Genet, who was a French diplomat, did his best to pull America into the war because, I mean, I just can't stress enough, it would have made sense for us to get involved because the French helped us so much in our war, particularly Lafayette, who was a part of the French Revolution. He wasn't like, Robespierre, who was leading it, but he was a major military leader in the war. So there were various privateering attacks against the British and Spanish, who were at the time doing their best to fight against France. This was, I guess, before the Spanish were just completely overrun by the French. So the British began stopping any ships carrying French goods, including American ships, which was a problem because, well, the British could do whatever the hell they wanted when it came to the ocean, and we couldn't do much to stop them. So John Jay went to England to work out a settlement, basically to have, reparations for all the goods that were essentially stolen by the British. However, he was not able to get the British to agree to just stop stealing guys off our ships, because essentially what was happening is a number of English naval officers and just regular Navy guys were leaving the English Navy and just like joining American merchant ships because they just didn't want to fight anymore. But they knew how to sail, and working aboard a merchant ship's a lot easier than, being on a naval vessel. So the excuse for the British was, hey, we've got guys that are abandoning their posts. We're going to search your ship. And it's been 10 years, not even, well, this is, let's say 89, 93. This has been, 10 years since our war ended. The Americans and the British aren't really that different yet. Like, there's not a distinctive accent yet. So they could just come aboard American ships and be like, oh, you guys look British enough. You must have run away. And then they just, throw people onto their ship and leave. So they were essentially kidnapping American sailors and putting them in the Navy, which normally would be an act of war, but we didn't have enough of a Navy to do anything about it. This is the Bastille. This is France's big day. This is their version of July 4th. So rather than signing a piece of paper, the French destroyed or at least overran, partially destroyed a prison in the middle of Paris that was supposedly, a prison and an arsenal, so they were able to also get a lot of weapons. That supposedly housed a bunch of political prisoners. Ended up it didn't, but it was still this big symbolic victory, so they celebrated it as their big day. Bastille Day, which is July 14th, 1789, I suppose. Um, yeah, so that's their big day. And here's the neutrality proclamation. It's like, nah, we're not involved. And Genet wanting us to get involved, and then John Jay doing his best to keep the British from taking our crap. But you know how the British are. Ooh, there's. All right. So, as I already spoiled for you guys, because I know how deep this plot is, the Democratic Republican Party formed to oppose the Federalists. So basically, the Anti-Federalists realized their name was stupid and created a party that had its own identity. Yeah. So, I mean, just imagine you have, like, the Republican Party, and then the other party is the anti-Republican Party. I mean, that's not an identity. That's just, we don't like the other guys. Like, okay, that sucks. Now, to our modern idea of parties, the Democratic Republican Party seems weird, but don't worry. We'll get there. This was basically just, again, the Anti-Federalists. They were the group that, well, obviously opposed the Federalists. They wanted to remove the British and Spanish troops on the frontier, and frontier farmers were rallying against a whiskey tax, which resulted in the Whiskey Rebellion, because there was a tax on whiskey. Probably can pick that up. Turmoil on the frontier. But this was the big thing about the Whiskey Rebellion. Well, there's two big things about the Whiskey Rebellion. One of them is that when there is turmoil, when there is armed uprising in a region that borders another nation's holdings, that's going to spill over. Because, again, national borders don't exist. They're not real. There is no line on the ground that says you are now in whatever place. And if you've driven to another state, you'll see like a sign, hey, you're now in whatever. But like if you're just walking through the woods, like if you're up in, say, upstate South Carolina, and you're walking through the mountains in the woods, and you cross over to North Carolina, you're not going to know that. There's no line across the ground. And if there's like a freaking rebellion happening, people are fighting, and it's spreading across the countryside, it's not going to be like, oh, wait, hold on, guys, this is the line, and over there is the British. We can't go over there. That's not going to happen. The violence is going to spread. And when that happens, and this is an old thing, this goes back to Europe, it goes back to, I mean, it's any kind of human society. When the violence spills over into another kingdom's territory, they're going to want to do something about it. And often what they do is send their troops back over the line to put down that violence. And now that they've got troops over the line, they'll just take the region over. Because clearly, whoever owned that region to begin with, which this is America, couldn't keep these people in line, and the violence was disrupting the other people to begin with. So it's technically, while not like a legal seizure of land, it's seen as justified. So keeping these people from causing a lot of ruckus is a way to make sure that the British or Spanish don't justifiably take over that land. And among the folks in the Whiskey Rebellion was one Herman Husband, the former leader of the North Carolina Regulators, who we talked about like several chapters back. Yeah, he's still alive, and he is causing trouble once again. So the other thing to remember about the Whiskey Rebellion is, compared to Shays' Rebellion, where the federal government couldn't do anything and had to rely on the state militia, which, by the way, the Whiskey Rebellion was so far into the frontier that there was no state militia to do anything about it. Now that we've got the Constitution, now that we've got some levels of taxes happening, the federal government does have troops and does have the power to step in. Now that said, apparently there was a yellow fever outbreak in Philadelphia, and it slowed everything down, because you can't exactly deploy troops that are sick and dying. Eventually, though, Washington rallied about 13,000 troops from 4 states and rolled in to quash the rebels. Now that said, while it was a violent troops against the rebels action, only 2 leaders are actually tried and convicted, and then Washington pardoned them after the fact. There was no and then the leaders were hanged for their treasonous acts against the I want to say the crown, because that's what it would have been seen as, against the government. Washington got it. He's like, okay, you guys are unhappy about these taxes. Okay, I get it. We literally just finished a war for that. But you guys need to chill. We're not going to hang you for it, but we got to stop you guys from, burning stuff down. That's what we're doing. So while it did prove that the government could handle itself, which was nice, it actually caused some Americans to be concerned about how things are being handled. For example, Jefferson resigned from his position as Secretary of State in protest, and he joined with Madison in protesting the government's policies of keeping people from burning towns down, I guess. Yeah. Which, on the one hand, I get, you don't want the government to be too heavy-handed, but at the same time, it's this is really early in America's creation, and we were really, really shaky, and it would have taken very little for outside nations to just, start taking land from us. It would be like if today, they're having protests in Chicago, and then Canada just swoops in and takes Chicago. It's no, we don't have that concern. So again, the Federalists and Democratic Republicans, Hamilton and Adams against Jefferson and Madison, strong central government versus a weak central government, large central bank and state banks, powerful navy, minimal navy, businesses are wealthy versus we're largely farmers, craftsmen, and ordinary people. And then, as I had mentioned before, a loose interpretation of Congress versus they don't actually have it written here, but a more strict interpretation of Congress. Congress, I keep saying that. The Constitution. What is wrong with my brain? All right. Whiskey Rebellion. Got a guy getting tarred and feathered here, which ain't good, because as I may have mentioned to you guys, the tar is molten, so it burns your skin, and then the feather is just humiliation on top. I like that this is the Whiskey Rebellion, and you've got a kid running through here blowing a horn, having a great time. Like, yeah, no tax on whiskey. It's like, kid. I mean, there wasn't really like a minimum age for whiskey, so I'm sure that kid knew what whiskey tasted like. So a few more things going on. We had the Indian Trade and Intercourse Act. This was meant to basically keep the settlers and the natives from fighting each other. But, well, as things often happen with Americans when it comes to Native Americans, they just ignored it. Lots of conflict, traders, settlers, and even the troops that were sent there to maintain the peace would just fight natives. The settlers and traders, that kind of made sense. But then the troops would be sent in to, like, split them up and make everybody get along. But the troops were just as racist as everybody else, so they just go in and shoot the natives too. So we had Chief Little Turtle of the Miami Nation, brought together a bunch of other native nations, and went to war against the U.S., was eventually defeated at the Battle of Fallen Timbers by General Anthony Wayne. This ended with the Treaty of Greenville. So this is like the major native conflict in this section of the book. We'll see many more. Excuse me. We have the Jay Treaty. Once again, this is John Jay when he went to Britain to work out the whole, like, hey, stop taking our ships thing. It had a number of different ideas to it. The British needed to withdraw from U.S. soil because we still had British troops on U.S. soil along the frontier because they just didn't give a crap. Also, I mean, this was the late 1700s. There was definitely no kind of satellite imaging or communication beyond dude on horse with letter. So it was really easy to just like have foreign troops roaming around in the countryside and nobody really knowing or really being able to get that information out before they're gone. So this was a formal declaration of, hey, you can't have troops on our land, guys. But it did require that the U.S. pay its debts back to Britain from before the war, and also limited trade in the West Indies. And also, as we mentioned before, this did not stop the British from taking sailors off of ships and just throwing them into the Royal Navy with the very thin excuse of, well, they might be British sailors who abandoned their posts. So yeah, the British were giving us a hard time. On the other hand, we had the Pinckney Treaty. So this was a treaty with Spain by the envoy Thomas Pinckney. Pinckney was a South Carolina planter, not exactly a diplomat, but a plantation owner here from South Carolina. It did a number of things. Recognized the 31st parallel, which is, hemisphere, or latitude. That's what Rand's trying to say. Boundary between the Spanish and American territory. So it's what caused. I've got a map here in just a minute. I don't know why I'm trying to put it into words. It's what gave us essentially what the Florida border is now. Also opened Mississippi and New Orleans to trade, which was a big deal because if you recall from earlier, we had pissed the Spanish off and they closed New Orleans to trade, which hurt a lot. New Orleans was like a major trading post. and for the Spanish to cut that off, well within their rights, but it hurt. And this treaty was making nice with the Spanish again. So I've got a couple things here with the Indian Intercourse Acts. Unless the murdering of Indians can be restrained by bringing the murderers to condign punishment, which is to say, treat it like they're murdering any other human. All exertions of the government to prevent destructive retaliations by the Indians will prove fruitless, and all our present agreeable prospects illusory. Which is to say, we have to punish people for murdering natives, because if we don't, they're just going to keep doing it, and therefore the natives are going to continue to retaliate, and we're not going to have any chance of having peace with them because they were going to be well within their rights to retaliate. Washington got it. So there is General Wayne at Battle of Fallen Timbers. The Jade Treaty. Britain had to withdraw from Northwest Territory. American ships could trade the West Indies. It also settled the boundary between the U.S. and Canada, because, again, remember the map I had before had some, like, a couple little disputed areas up in the north. So that's good, because, again, disputed areas are just going to cause problems. We did have to pay off any kind of debts that our citizens had to Britain before the war began. You couldn't just say, well, the war happened and now we're a different country, so it's not a thing anymore, which is what the Soviet Union did after the fall of Russia. Britain would not agree to stop seizing ships, and it barely made it through the Senate because it was a very unpopular treaty. While it did do a number of things that were good, Britain still really put us through the ringer and still was able to just, like, seize ships that they suspected of harboring runaway sailors. So, yeah. Pinckney's Treaty. Troops of His Catholic Majesty occupying posts within the limits of the United States were withdrawn within the same time period to be withdrawn. I can't words. That's the main thing is, because if you recall from an earlier map, all this up here was considered Florida territory, and so now they've just moved it down to be more even. Well, I guess it still is kind of drop here, but 31st parallel is considered right here. So now this is Florida, this is part of Spain, and this is also Spanish. So it can all connect right here, but Mississippi is given a little bit more land down this way. And not obviously later on this is just made part of Mississippi, so Mississippi can have access to the coast. But yeah, and then again, the main things for me personally, being able to use the Mississippi and use New Orleans for trade, because the way trade was usually done when it came to rivers, you'd have farmers and stuff way upriver, and again, Mississippi goes all the way up. If you had a farm next to the river, or just near the river, you'd bring your stuff to the river, build a raft, because you usually had lots of extra lumber around, and you just put your stuff on the raft with something on there to, identify it as yours, and you just send it downriver. It would just float downriver to the port of New Orleans, or, anywhere over here, depending what river you use, and they would take the stuff, and often the barge, because the barge would be made out of logs that they could sell, and they would sell that stuff, and then whatever that was worth, they would send that money back up to your farm. So it was a pretty good system. But if you're not allowed to use the Mississippi or the port down here, that's not going to work, and you're wasting so much time and effort sending stuff back, over land. So, real big deal. All right. Let's finish the chapter. 1796. Washington was allowed to run again because there was no precedent for how many times a president could run. He had run twice, won unanimously both times, and then he was like, yeah, you know what, 2 seems good. And pretty much from then on until Franklin Roosevelt, who I think had 4 terms, because it was World War II and we needed him. Pretty much everybody after this has been like, okay, well, Washington did too, so we should all do too. And then it was eventually made a law. 1796 was the first election between candidates of opposing factions. Due to this, they hadn't really worked things out for how, president and vice president would be done. So while John Adams won, the next person who got the most votes was his opponent, Thomas Jefferson, and Thomas Jefferson was therefore made vice president. Can you imagine? The winner is made president, and the person who comes in second, which is to say that person's opponent, is made vice president. That was a nightmare. So the people, like the Electoral College and the other politicians in power, were like, oh, well, this will just make them work together because they're at each other's throats all the time. Well, rather than that, Adams worked with Hamilton, and Jefferson just led the opposition in Congress. So, yeah, they didn't get along at all. There was an incident known as the XYZ affair. I don't know, it's an awful name, but what are you going to do? Basically, the French started doing what the British had been doing, seizing American ships. We sent a delegation to France to get them to stop and pay us for the goods they had taken. However, once we got there, the 3 French agents, who were named only as X, Y, and Z in the records because, the French agents weren't supposed to be specifically named for anonymity reasons, demanded a bribe before they would even speak to the Americans because, the French. You got to bribe them before they'll even talk to you. This eventually was made public, and people were pissed. So there was sort of an undeclared, quasi sort of war with France for 2 years. It wasn't really a shooting war. It was more of a trade war where we weren't really trading with France, and tensions were high, but there was no big epic battles and forts being taken and ships being sunk. But it was a little bit rough there for a while. It was very much an almost war. Also, the Alien and Sedition Acts, which, boy, we will see again next semester in a slightly different context. This was meant to stamp out any kind of dissent. So the Alien Act, the president could deport or imprison any non-citizen, which was directed at the Scottish and Irish who opposed the Federalist pro-British stance, because, again, we're anti-French now because of things, the XYZ affair. So if we're anti-French, then some members of the government, at least the Federalists, are now pro-British. So the Scots and Irish specifically are never going to be pro-British. So they're still very anti-British. and they're using these alien acts to like kick them out of the country because they're anti-British. I don't know. Again, boy, sure is nice we don't have stuff like that anymore. Naturalization Act made it harder to become a citizen. Rather than 5 years, it took 14 years. And then the Sedition Act outlawed false, scandalous, or malicious statements against the president or Congress. Just remember these things, just for, when you're listening to the news, they might come up again. Just saying. Yeah, so here's a real weird depiction of the XYZ affair at the French delegates as a multi-headed man that's also like a pirate for some reason. I don't know. Now this one is a bit further in the future. And it's also a washing, like a liquid soap ad that's also very racist and kicking out the Chinese, because we had a super racist anti-Chinese thing in the West. But that's just part of the alien acts. Sedition law, again, this is a bit more in the future, but you've got traitors, spies, Sinn Féin. These are Irish, who they were terrorists, mostly against the British, but they would cause trouble just to get to the British. And then down here you have the IWW. I don't think anybody in here knows what the IWW is. Nobody? They were the industrial workers of the world. They were a trade union. And they were treated with the same scrutiny as literal traitors, spies, and terrorists, because we're terrified of trade unions here in the U.S. Yeah. So, again, we'll get to that more next semester, but that's the whole thing. And then the sedition bills, free press, free speech, honest opinion, as the gag rules would have it, yeah, you're just gonna be devoured, because you don't have free speech or free press if anything you say can be considered sedition and you go to jail. Because what is sedition? Just whatever the government decides they don't like. As I say, being recorded, that the government might not like. So, Democrat Republicans use these acts to label the Federalists as the new British, because the Federalists were very, elitist. And there was a lot of debate among the states over how much power the Federalists were using, and how much power that the federal government was getting. If the federal government, again, could just arrest people for bad-mouthing the government, we're just back to Britain at that point. So the election of 1800 was very close, and it was not a clean race. There was a lot of really bitter vitriol between the candidates. Again, I always say that, people are like, oh, well, in the past, people were more civil and blah, 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 blah. It's like, no, in the past, people were just as petty and vindictive as they are today. In fact, I've got an image here that, unfortunately, didn't have a chance to put up on the board. But they would fight with canes, and in the case of the image here, what was it? Brandishing tongs from the fireplace. They would have combat in Congress. They would fight each other. We had a representative from here in South Carolina that beat a guy from Massachusetts so bad with his cane that the cane broke. And I mean, when I say cane, I mean like shillelagh, like it was a club. Yeah, we not to say that some of the crap in Congress is especially civil these days, but it was definitely bad in the past too. Anyway, Jefferson eventually won, and while technically Aaron Burr got the same amount of votes as Jefferson, again, they weren't like joint tickets yet. Since Aaron Burr was on the ticket as Jefferson's running mate, he was made Jefferson's vice president. Even though, again, technically he got just as many votes as Jefferson and could have technically been made president instead of Jefferson. I don't know. Again, they didn't quite have the process down yet. Jefferson called his victory a revolution achieved by suffrage of the people. And I think the book actually says here, yeah, revolution achieved not by the sword, but by the suffrage of the people, which, okay, only about 500,000, about 500,000 of the 5.3 million people in America could actually vote. So, like, not even all the white men in America could vote. Only, like, those who had a certain amount of property. And those who were, like, American enough, so, like, the Irish and the Scottish and the Germans and whatnot who had immigrated recently were not allowed to vote. But, that said, despite these parties that were very aggressively opposed to one another, and having a really close race, and being borderline violently opposed to one another, there was a peaceful transfer of power. And it did go from the Federalists to the Democrat Republicans, and nobody got murdered over it. Nobody tried to storm the Capitol over it, which in 1800, France was currently on fire. Still, I mean, this was, Napoleon was now in charge in France. Russia is just always having little mini revolts and revolutions. So to have a peaceful transfer of power in 1800 is pretty impressive. Again, despite the fact that, like, only a tiny percentage of Americans could actually vote, so it's not really representing everybody, it's still something to be proud of. So here we have the split, Jefferson and Burr versus Adams, Pinckney, and apparently John Jay was there. He got a whole one vote. Good work, John Jay. Now, again, these are obviously electoral votes. And it's nice to see, and I feel like this would probably be a lot better for, actual individual representation. But as you can see, a lot of these states are split, where some of their votes are going one way and some of the votes are going the other way because of how the states are actually being represented, rather than, oh, well, you've got 51% of the state is going one way, so the whole state goes that way, which just like negates all the votes of the people that voted in the opposite direction. So yeah, anyway, yeah, so we had secured our independence, but man, it was rough there at the start. Economic hardship, natives that didn't want us there, which again, fair. um, Stuff happening in Europe. It was rough at the start, and again, it's when we talk about the founding fathers being important in the creation of America. It was not just the war and the Declaration of Independence. It was all this after, and honestly, for me, I feel like going out in a field and shooting at a bunch of dudes in red coats is easier than navigating all of this. Sure, you're not getting shot at, but getting shot at is a lot simpler than trying to navigate all this political crap. But they were able to move quickly, able to move decisively, and managed to keep the country from falling apart before we even had a country. Washington, once again, he was good at leading people, and that's what we needed. Hamilton knew what he was doing with the economy, and of course, getting rid of the Articles of Confederation and making the Constitution was very important in making the country strong enough to move on. There were, of course, setbacks. Washington actually didn't want political parties. He didn't want this split, the Democrat Republicans and the Federalists. He believed that it would cause issues, but even within his presidency, there was already the factions. And once there was the next election after he was done, it was the two factions. And this would inform policy for quite some time, at least until the War of 1812, where the Federalists completely lost their power, and the Democratic Republicans dominated for a while until they split as well into, if you can imagine it, Democrats and Republicans. But we'll get to that later on. And with 4 minutes to go, I think we'll end it here. So yeah, that was chapter 8? No, 7. We'll start chapter 8 next week. So yeah, I'll see y'all next Monday.